play the intro. Hello everyone, this is Philosophy of the People, and it's the first time for everything as I managed to forget to play the intro. If you didn't see that, which I'm sure almost everyone who's watching live won't have, then that's fine. For those who are watching on the VOD, whoopsie doops, as they say. Here today, I want to... Oh, Fakey13 saw it. I want to talk about the idea that there's lots of terrible things online. Bodies of blown up kids and people burning alive in hospitals, and all sorts of terrible things. And there's an idea that we have some kind of moral obligation to look at them, to look at horrible images, to look what is in essence gore, and whether there's any real substance to the idea that there is some moral responsibility for us to look at these things. So it's notable about present wars is that slaughtered civilian populations can post themselves being slaughtered. The people who were exterminated in European ghettos during the Second World War weren't able to do this. Any footage or anything like that was first off almost impossible to film, and then if you could film it, there was no real way to get it out of these ghettos. And more broadly, basically all kind of filming of conflict was done by very much official sources and often was just staged or whatever, like relatively little combat footage from the Second World War is like real combat footage. And it's also seemingly very hard to stop soldiers posting their war crimes. So it's not just the slaughtered civilians in the Gaza ghetto who can post themselves doing war crimes, but the IDF has posted an incredible, IDF soldiers have posted themselves doing an incredible number of war crimes, especially mass demolition of civilian objects. This is on top of the fact that artillery and aircraft dominated war make for fantastically horrible dead humans, as well as facilitating the aforementioned ability for these things to be filmed. One reason that it's easy for these for Palestinian people to film their genocide, their extermination, is because the Israelis are striking from far away, so they strike and they kill people, but then afterwards you can film. Obviously, you probably shouldn't film too close because there might be a second hit, but there isn't actually normally an encroaching tank or something like this falling towards you. We are asked for various reasons to look at these things. So there's a moral obligation to look at these things and to keep looking at these things. There's been lots of hashtags like Eyes on Gaza, Eyes on Rafah, Eyes on Northern Gaza. But ultimately, looking at gore is bad for you. Looking at horrors is bad for you. So I think we need to seriously question whether there is a proper justification for us looking at these terrible things. So related to what we're saying about the Second World War, it's of course always been the case that, well, probably not always the case, but at least in the modern period, countries try to use stories of horror to communicate that we should support their side in the war. through claims of horrifying outrages being committed against them, such as the idea of the rape of Belgium, which was an alleged and partially true widespread campaign of war crimes that happened in occupied Belgium, especially in the first year of the First World War. But what's changed is that rather than being distributed in kind of press and like mocked up images and stuff like this, or carefully created footage by official state propaganda outlets, this stuff is instead mediated directly through phone cameras by ordinary people. If we wish to properly, very true, we're talking about that in slide 12. If we wish to properly witness what's happening in Gaza, we have to witness gore, we have to witness people burning alive. And there are claims that there is an epistemic in terms of knowing things, as well as a moral responsibility to look at the images. That we come to know them because they're the truth, that we should come to know them because they're the truth, and that knowing the truth is proper and necessary for us taking a proper moral position. There's this moral demand to not look away, some kind of claim that because they witnessed it, these oppressed people, these slaughtered, exterminated people, that we should also witness it, and that it's a betrayal of them, of their suffering, for us not to look at it. Especially normally because we have the idea that the reason that these Palestinian people video their slaughter and the reason that they then upload their slaughter is because they're recorded for the sake of being viewed. Gore. Gore has been, in recent years, has become one of the worst features of the internet. Especially millennial young men. I originally wrote late millennial young men. I don't know what older and younger people have to say. I wasn't exactly sure of when young men started showing each other horrible videos on the internet. Probably as soon as they could show each other horrible videos. But I don't know how common it is on Zoomers. But I don't have to name these videos. I'm sure you can all think of examples for yourselves. I was also wondering if there's a girls' women's equivalent to this, but I doubt it. Not to say that girls and women don't do horrible things too, but not particularly in this way. But millennial men, young men, grew up exposing each other and being exposed to horrible images and videos, as well as shock pornography, which is basically operates in the same way that gore does. It's meant to evict the same kind of reaction, though more of a disgust-based reaction than the direct kind of violent horror of gore. But they're used for the same reason. The point of these videos was to shock your friends, or to endure these things in order to mark out your masculinity, to be able to say, yeah, I watched it. The point was certainly not to enjoy them. If you showed these horrible videos to someone with the intent to shock and horrify them, and they enjoyed them, they would be a massive, horrible, disgusting freak. But of course, anything that comes with a thrill will become addicting to some, and so this process of sharing shock and gore videos and horrible things became addicting to some people, and these young men grew up, some of them, to become gore heads. But interestingly, for today, this kind of gore head young movement of horrible videos intersected with US racial violence, especially in the past 10 years. This stuff was the stuff which is happening in yeah, that would be something if I just went to slide 7 and it was just fucking goatsy or whatever. I promise that's not the case. I don't want to get 2 YouTube channels, neither of which I own, disabled. the ideological prefiguration of the current demands that we see around Palestine and witnessing the slaughter there emerge from American racial discourse, as does a lot of stuff these days. Not looking away from videos of Mike Brown being killed. I actually forget the name of was it Mike Brown? No, I don't think it was Mike Brown, the one that was choked to death. He was selling loose cigarettes. He was choked to death by the police in New York. Was a particularly horrible video. They're not at all gory, but just very horrible in the sense of feeling very inhuman and cruel and callous. But watching these videos was regarded as necessary. Not looking away was considered essential. You had to watch these videos of black men being killed in order to kind of break your heart open to really grasp the horror of things. To be clear, I'd never watched these videos, but that was the general politics. Oh yeah, it was Eric. It was Eric Garner, who was killed in New York while selling these cigarettes. Deliberately inducing in yourselves this kind of horrified reaction was meant to then launch you into action. But this discourse has been sharpened twice over and kind of pushed to absurdity in the context of the war in Gaza, where both the things happening and the images shown are much worse, and they're also happening with a tempo of violence which is a million times faster and more intense than what is happening in US racial discourse. But also there's the fact that compared to US racial discourse, at least with US racial discourse, the Democrats are usually willing to say, this is bad, this is wrong, as well as something similar goes on in the United Kingdom. But the thing is, with the Gaza war, politicians are basically completely unwilling to. Well, I mean, now they kind of say it's wrong, or at least it looks bad. But I think even going to say what Israel is doing there is wrong is too far for most mainstream politicians still. And the top on the fact is not just this need for acknowledgement, but it seems the possibility of justice or even an end to things seems very far away. And kind of each day this goes on, the further away you think as things develop, as things push on, we get closer to the end. But what it feels like in Gaza is it feels like, in fact, every day we get further from the end. It becomes this irrepressible kind of historical weight that somehow, even though it wasn't true a year ago, because it's now been true for 54 weeks, it seems that the Gaza war will never end. What are the general arguments that exist around the idea that you need to watch these videos of people being killed in Gaza or Lebanon or whatever else? So there's three arguments. The first one, I take it to be based around the fact that this stuff is being uploaded by Palestinians for the sake of you looking at it. So there's meant to be some obligation generated by this interaction, that we have some obligation to do what the oppressed wish of us. And this is linked to the idea that witnessing these things is easy, that it's kind of the least we can do, that we can all do it. It's easy to look at horrible videos on our phone in some sense. And that, so in that sense, it becomes such a minimal demand that anyone who refused to do it is kind of basically being like stingy, almost viciously stingy in how they approach political discourse. The second is the more kind of direct idea that witnessing this stuff is necessary, or at least incredibly helpful for leading to political action, where the witnessing itself is not meant to be that important. Rather, what is important is to use this horror to then move you into action. If you aren't already acting maximally, then it's taken that more can always be gained from watching these horrors. Finally, there is, and kind of in between the two things, is the idea that a general support for witnessing, not one that references a particular demand from the oppressed, but regardless of this demand, whether it exists or whether or not, there is an idea that there's something in of itself that's very important about witnessing these things, may that be epistemically or otherwise. Do we have an obligation to do what the oppressed wish of us? I think that's basically the crux of this argument, and whether this argument, this first argument, goes anywhere. But it's not clear to me at all that it's actually the case that we have this sort of obligation. Plausibly, we have obligations towards the oppressed, and certainly there's an obligation to do something about their conditions. And these things are different in of the fact that we might not have obligations to someone to stop a horrible thing happening to them, because that leads into a sort of subjectivism. Rather, that we might have just an obligation which exists and doesn't necessarily exist in reference to them to end certain conditions. But it's not clear, even if we have this sort of obligations. I think we certainly have obligations to do something about the conditions, but it's not clear why this would produce obligations to do as these people may wish. This is evident. I think it's important to draw out in context where Zionists will make various claims about real or alleged reactionary and conservative features of Palestinian and Arab society. So there was a big thing earlier in the war, mostly abandoned now, but based on the idea that, they're throwing gays off the rooftops in Gaza. And then it moved to more generic points around homophobia, and other sort of progressive Western issues, that these things aren't supported in Palestine and the broader Arab world. Any investigation of why that might be, beyond saying that, they're reactionary, Arab, Muslim, blah, 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 is obviously verboten, because these people don't give a shit about these things. They just want to use them as a weapon to hit you with. But what is the proper reaction to this sort of argument? Obviously, some people try to cope. They try and say, well, no, actually, they don't think that. Which to some degree they might not, but it seems to me to miss the issue. I think the correct response here is that regardless of these features, Palestinians do not deserve to be burnt alive, and support in Palestine produces no obligation to think as they think or to do as they wish. On this basis, it's not evident that just because Palestinians or Kurds in northeast Syria were seeing a similar, well, not a similar air campaign to Gaza, but there's been another Turkish air campaign where they're striking essential civilian infrastructure, and during the process of killed children. And my first kind of exposure to seeing blown up kids was not Arab Palestinian kids, but earlier in my life seeing Kurdish Syrian children being blown up and ruined and destroyed and mangled and so on. And both cultures seem to really believe that in showing these things off for whatever basis they might have. But it's not evident to me that we have any responsibility to do this because of what they wish, especially because, maybe like the relationship, or kind of relationship's a kind of weird word, but the relationship I have with the Kurdish political struggle is one in which I actively support it and was a member of it because of its socialist progressive character. And that may produce some obligation to go along with it. But my support for Palestine is not based, or support for Palestine, whatever, support for ending the genocide in Palestine is not contingent on any fact about Palestinian society. There wouldn't be any fact about Palestinian society which would produce in me the idea that we should actually genocide the Palestinians, or that we should support a genocide in Palestine, or that we should not oppose a genocide in Palestine. does horror inspire? To discuss the second argument. The second argument is the second argument here being the idea that we need to witness these horrors in order to produce a certain political feeling, political belief in ourselves and in others. This is an argument which obviously can't be answered by me sitting in my chair. It's something which implicates the social sciences. There needs to be studies done, though I don't know how you would do them. I guess it would have to be like not in field, but you'd have to just interview people who have online seen images of gore. So I don't think you could ever get approved from a research board to show people gore. But there would have to be testing and scientific research to kind of conclude the question of whether it's useful, politically useful, to show people horrible images in order to produce a certain response. And there's some anecdotal evidence that I've seen that would point in this direction. It seems that the most dedicated cadres of the pro-Palestinian movement in the West, Palestinian Action, who are especially large, well, not large, I guess, yeah, large compared to the other groupings. Palestinian Action in the UK are a very small central cadre, but are incredibly effective in attacking and destroying supply arms factories and other production places for Israeli weapons and support equipment. And these people seem to be inspired by the horrors in Gaza more often than not. They seem to reference these horrors and seeing these horrors. So there's some anecdotal evidence that would kind of lead to thinking that it might be useful. But my remark here would be to point out that the tempo of horror in Gaza is a million times more intense than the horrors of watching US racial violence or basically watching the horrors of anything else. And I think that inevitably comes, this watching doesn't eventually produce anything in you apart from becoming immune to it. You can only your horror can only be inspired so many times. Eventually you're going to become deadened to it. I think it's clear that daily viewings of mangled bodies of children will have the main effect of eventually you becoming numb to seeing the bodies of mangled children, which I don't think is good for anyone. I think the only possible truth, the suggestion that might be the case, is that moderate viewing of the mangled corpses of children can induce political action. Yeah, I think that's one possibility I didn't necessarily want to talk about. But obviously, yeah, I imagine the Palestinian war, genocide, and so on will also produce gore heads. It's obviously produced gore heads on the Israeli side. There was an expose a while ago now by Israel's leading liberal newspaper, which I've now forgotten the name of, Haaretz. I can't remember. I'm quite dyslexic. Can't remember exactly how the letters go. It's a foreign word to me. But yes, this newspaper exposed the fact that not only were Israelis watching, like there were Telegram channels with hundreds of thousands of subscribers in Hebrew language of Palestinian gore being posted, but it was being posted by these Israeli Telegram chats, not in order to be horrified by it, but to enjoy it. It was something that existed for pleasure in order to incite enjoyment, jouissance, or whatever. And then it was discovered that this was actually being run by someone. Was it in Mossad? It was someone in military intelligence, their kind of counter-information division. Hello to David in the give them an argument chat. And the third argument I'll cover across two different points. which is the general virtue of witnessing horrible things, which we should first talk about in terms of an epistemic responsibility. Do we have an epistemic responsibility? Do we have a responsibility to know certain things as regarding bad things that are happening? It would certainly seem so if we have any sort of moral responsibility. Because first we need to know what our moral responsibilities are, where they're occurring, what is their nature, and very importantly, what can we do about them? Because moral obligations are obligations about action. They're action-orientated obligations, and ought implies can, as we'll discuss in the next slide. Oh no, I'll discuss on the next slide. Obviously, there's an issue with Palestine that is very far away. It's not clear what we can really do about it, unless you want to go to prison. But let's imagine that through donations or raising awareness, there is a sufficient possibility of changing things in order to mean that there is like an ought implied can here. There is a moral responsibility to do something. So that would produce in us an epistemic responsibility to understand what is going on. With the more pressing matter, in fact, being a responsibility to understand what you might be able to do about it. Epistemic means, someone asked in the chat, epistemic is about knowing, about the things that we know, as opposed to moral responsibility, which is about acting, which is about action. In this context of epistemic responsibility, why might we have to look at the mangled bodies of children? The idea behind this is that merely knowing intellectually that these children are being killed is not sufficient in us to really root and hotwire into us the knowledge that this is happening. Rather, we need to sit and stew and really witness and grasp the horror of these things. And I think this directly derives from one of the great suspicions of our age, which is the lack of trust in our rational capacities. It's a lack of trust in ourselves and others for us to simply know things rationally and reasonably. We only think we can really understand something if we understand it emotionally. It has to be emotionally shocked into us for us to really actually understand it. I think fundamental to this idea of witnessing, to witnessing horrors, is a powerlessness over ourselves. We don't think that we can resolve these issues without kind of directly grasping with them, without directly seeing the horrors. We can't just trust in our own ability to know things. And the same goes for others. And then this is combined with our powerlessness generally, where instead of being part of mass organizations that can make certain demands and take certain actions, we're all isolated persons in social media where we feel the need. Our politics, our engagement with the world is based around what we post and what posts we look at. This is the basic structure that is implicit here, that to look at these things is all we can do. We don't imagine that we can have a greater power over the world than just looking at things and showing things to other people. We're back to where we were when we were 13 and we were pointing the fucking flip camera phone at each other and being like, look at this horrible thing, mate. But now it's meant to be this kind of political and moral responsibility as opposed to like a transgressive horror show. The initial sharing of these scenes did have a certain innocence to it. I think in the early days of the war, and as more and more horrors were posted, we could plausibly give an account when we say, if we show these things to enough people, it'll make a difference. And that was true in large part. It seems to me that it is the case that sharing these horrors, or at least these horrors being known to exist, I don't know what percentage of people actually look at them, but kind of people can have like a sympathetic horror reaction, believing others who actually witness these things about how terrible they are. I think this did a large part to kind of undermine the support for Israel in the West among normal people, not among politicians. But the claim that the sharing of these scenes is going to stop them, is going to have some more effect, some greater effect than they've already had, seems entirely delusional. What is there for us to do? I think is the watchword of our generation. What else is there to do apart from look at things in social media? We say this despite the fact that clearly there are things to be done, though if we return to Palestine Action, due to their marginality and kind of semi-underground nature, it's hard to get involved in these things in ways that don't lead to prison. Which, to be clear, isn't true or shouldn't be true. It should be possible to be a mass supporter of Palestine Action, to not get involved in their extremist, I don't mean extremist, I mean like kind of the far end of the politics they get up to while being one of their supporters. But I don't think Palestine Action is actually structured in such a way as really to facilitate this. There's very much a focus on their actionists, and they're not committed. They're not kind of linked for obvious reasons. They're not linked to the trade union movement or anything like this. And even in their statements, they distance themselves from their actionists, because otherwise they would be basically just be a criminal organization. Of course, if we take it that we've been treated to do when looking at these bodies. Sorry, that was an absolute mess of a sentence. Of course, if we are to take these bodies seriously in the way that people say we should be taking this seriously, then to go to prison, in fact, seems like the rightful path. But this is not what the people who say these things are doing. Instead, people are stuck in a condition where they feel the need to constantly bombard themselves with horrors without this producing any real result. To return to an earlier point, we can say about Palestine Action, plausibly, that these people witnessed the horror and this led them into action. But how many people have witnessed these horrors and been properly horrified by them and then not become a member of Palestine Action? 99.99% of them. So the kind of decisive factor in what leads these people to go to Palestine Action can't be the fact that they witness these things, because for nearly everyone, it's not the case. And this is the end of my slides, so start asking questions if you want to, but I just remembered that I wanted to talk about the fact, I touched on it with mentioned the Israeli gore channels, but I think the idea that by posting these horrors, we kind of reveal something which is important, that will lead to political good things, is flawed in the sense that I was going to say it assumes kind of a universalism, that it does actually, there's a certain universalism to it, but it's a bad sort of universalism. It's universalism which is based on the idea that everyone agrees that Palestinians are, I was going to say rightful victims, or was it wrongful victims? The idea that everyone agrees that Palestinians do not deserve this happening to them. But of course, the problem for most ardent supporters of Israel isn't that, they deny that they're just unaware that this stuff is happening. Again, as at this point, you can't claim innocence. You can't claim that these things aren't happening. But lots of people, and I think this is will be one of the great struggles of the future, is just the division of the world into enemies, and enemies who deserve to be exterminated and destroyed, and our friends who don't deserve to be exterminated and destroyed. But I think the problem is also the people who think that Palestinians don't deserve to be exterminated aren't universalists in themselves. They'll also think when other people are being slaughtered, they often won't care either. Like, which percentage of people who really care about the horrors of Gaza right now give a shit about what happened on October 7th, and obviously that is part a positionality thing. You don't want to really engage with October 7th because it's blatantly used by Zionists as their sharpest stick. But I think it's just the case that, basically no one is universalist anymore. No one can give a shit about every... there's some group that everyone believes need to be slaughtered, even if they wouldn't say it in quite those words. When it came to it, they'd be like, the best they could give is a shrug. There's a banger in a recent article. Harry Bar El, a human rights lawyer in Tel Aviv, said, "Do you know why I hate Hamas? I hate Hamas because it forces my children to kill Palestinian children." So there's various ways, as demonstrated by that quote, there's various ways of engaging with slaughter without agreeing with what you put out there. That's the problem with putting out the kind of politics of putting out horrible video to inspire a reaction. Is not everyone will have the same reaction. This kind of goes back to the very first point I was discussing around goreheads, where you show them something in the assumption that they will be horrified, but in fact they enjoy it. And it's not just that there'll be a small minority who enjoy looking at the slaughter, but there'll be people, an endless line of people, who will reconstruct it in a different way so that it doesn't kind of harm or force them to change their politics. Right, I'm going to read chat now. Yeah, I mean, look, people will just deny that October 7th happened just in this chat, or that it was anything apart from a righteous military position operation. Yeah, and that's the thing that you can't post this stuff on Instagram, which is for the best, I think. The world's main gore site is Twitter. You can see gore on Reddit too, but there's not really a big movement of a big subreddit that I know of which posts kind of Palestinian slaughter for the sake of the slaughtered. Yeah, and it's not just because people are lazy or something like this, or they're pathetic or they're unvirtuous or whatever, but rather because of how our world has been reconstructed. People just don't know even how to start, or they don't even really think. They don't grasp that this is what they must do. I think there's a problem where people who know more and understand more will assume that people who understand less do understand what they know, but they just choose not to act upon it. When actually the reality is that lots of people, even things that you think are just basic and obvious and stupid, like Palestine won't be saved no matter how hard you post, that would come to as a surprise to a lot of people. I mean, I'm genuinely not impressed when people say things like this, where it's like, well, if you think these things matter, then go out and do something about those things. Don't come to people who are doing something, at least posting about Palestine, and be like, why don't you care about Burma? Just you go post about Burma, you know? Um, Though obviously, I mean, what's happening in Burma is the rebels are just winning. You know, I'm sure everyone that supports Palestine would just like the situation in Burma to be the case in Palestine, um, where the rebels are winning against the bad dictatorship or whatever. But recently, because there's been a sustained Turkish terror campaign against Rojava in the past week, lots of Kurds have been posting along the lines of like, look at the massive demonstrations that American college students have used to defend Kurds or whatever. And it's just like photos of no one around, and no one's doing anything, and so on. Um, and yeah, I think this is just a kind of an unpleasant sort of resentment where, right, there is this economy of care, but you shouldn't begrudge it from people who are factually having horrible things happening to them. What you should do is try to cultivate your own politics and your own support and not complain that the Palestinians are getting something at all, you know. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, last week I was just talking about fucking BBLs and shit, but now this is the real shit. Yeah, I mean, maybe you have a responsibility to archive these videos, um, but unless you're submitting them to the International Criminal Court, I don't see the need to share them. Yeah, I mean, Germans all deny that they saw anything about the Holocaust. And there was a lot of like willful denial where they like people were living a mile from the gas camps and saw thousands of people go in and no one come out and just like, yeah, I'm sure nothing's happening in there. Well, fucking, yeah, I'm not going to think about it. Huh, really? Is that how it works? Yeah. I didn't think you could post gore or anything really horrible on Instagram. I thought it was really quite censorious. Yeah, I mean, there's various reasons. I mean, people will go like, why do people care more about Palestine than other things? But they don't actually want an answer. Like, there is an obvious, like, there are various answers that you can give. There's various ways you can investigate this. But almost always when someone asks that question, they're not actually asking an epistemic question about how Palestinians came to be able to kind of manufacture outrage and horror about what's happening to them. Well, other groups are worse at it. They just kind of bring that up to kind of complain and then to delegitimize concern about Palestine. And obviously, you know, a lot of the, like, you know, the fact that Jews are doing it is a large reason where that a lot of concern for Palestine emerges from. The fact that Jews are doing it is very useful for various Muslim and Western anti-Semites. But that doesn't change the fact still remains that we should care. You can dig and dig and dig and pull out all these reasons. The fact that kind of the Arab world has this powerful media empire, especially in recent years, funded by dirty oil money and blah blah blah, and the disdain, the global disdain for Jews, and how that pushes things, and so on and so forth. But you can explain all these things, and it's useful to explain all these things, and you should talk about all these things. But then, in the end, none of them delegitimize the actual reasons for care. Yeah, and so you'll have demands for raising awareness on social media, like you should post this, you should share this, and then protests will happen. But the protests don't exist for anything else apart from also raising awareness. They're not a protest which has some sustained goal of going to this place, this Israeli arms factory every week and picketing it outside. Rather, they're urban walkabouts which exist to kind of demonstrate social force, but without any kind of structure which goes past that. If you're going to demonstrate social force, it should be for the sake, in raising awareness, it should be for the sake of something else. But as I discussed a lot on my PhD on privilege, which I might eventually do a show on, awareness becomes a goal in and of itself, a lot of contemporary movements. Yes, things are definitely getting worse in that regard. Yeah, and so it's interesting to reflect on this situation because obviously for some period concern for Kurds existed in the West, but only when they aligned with Western interests. And when this disappeared, obviously not with any fault of their own, but Kurds isolated from Western interests when they're not directly supported by the West, still have a limited capacity to kind of stir up outrage in the West outside of their own communities and outside of particular far left communities. Apparently, it's Asexual Awareness Week this week. I learned that from going on. I learned that from going on the Twitter of the publisher who cancelled Ben. Ben's been cancelled, guys. They cancelled a whole series of curated essays because Ben and McManus had written for right wing newspapers, and some of the guy in the essay collection like referenced Nick Land. Yeah, the Hamas managed to kill their first brigade commander. I mean, I discussed it a couple of weeks ago, but yeah, they killed their first brigade commander, who was the guy who ordered the destruction of the Rafah water plant, which produced half of the clean water in Gaza, and he was a Druze. Really? Yeah, I mean, those jails really do suck, but it's hard to be sympathetic to the people inside them. I mean, I guess it's easy to be sympathetic to the children which are inside them, but otherwise it's not. I mean, it's obviously the problem is that you realize that these horrible prisons don't do anything but produce more ISIS members. Um, but it's not like they're horrible because it's not because of prisons in the United States are horrible because kind of they choose to do so. They're horrible in Rojava because there just isn't the money to do anything more. Already, like a massive amount of the budget is spent on keeping up these tens of thousands of prisoners in horrible conditions. But even keeping a person up in a horrible condition is really difficult for a government which just has very small resources and spends nearly all the resources on its military. And the West has repeatedly failed to secure to do any to feel obligated or to really do anything about these prisoners, to take them home or to fund their imprisonment and their trials or anything. Like all these ISIS members are held without trials, because the local government in northeast Syria doesn't want to commit to trying them because they think they should be tried by the West. And if they aren't being tried by the West, this is international terrorists. And if they aren't being tried by the West, they feel that the West should at least pay for them to be tried. But the West is completely unwilling to acknowledge their responsibility regarding their citizens. Actually, I think the largest group of Russia has been all right with taking their prisoners, as well as I think the best countries have actually been the Central Asian countries. But obviously, that's quite easy for them because they didn't have that many members, citizens in these jails. Yeah, true. Because obviously, the Jews are also big in Lebanon and big in Dara in Syria. Um, but if that is everything, unless anyone else wants some questions or comments on the horror and the horrors we might be seeing in the future, well, yeah, I mean, if it hasn't been clear, don't watch these videos, don't look at them. Trust in your own rational capacity to understand that bad things are happening without having to subject yourself to these horrors. Um, Looking at these things is not helpful to anyone. It will damage your soul in about as closest way to reality. Like looking at dead bodies, looking at horrors is not something that's meant to happen to humans. Um, and when it does, in the rare circumstances when you see it, you don't want your reaction to be so incredibly dulled that you react in an unhuman way to me, God, to the event, um, unless you're like a first responder or something. And that will be all, everyone. Um, I guess next week has to be on. Maybe Ben will be back, but I guess next week has to be on the US election. It has to be on not voting. Um, Not voting for Kamala Harris. It's October, so horror is part of Halloween. Very true. Yeah. But yeah, I guess next week has to be on big Kamala Harris and whether you should vote for her. The answer is no. The answer is no, but I'm sure I'll be able to draw that no out for an hour. Also, don't vote for Donald Trump, for God's sake. Jesus. Um, don't vote for Kamala Harris. And yeah, good luck to you all. Good night.